So there you go. So like I said, when Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, we're still doing let's say the ayah that we're working on, ayah number 4 in Surah Al Maida. So inshallah we'll be continuing from there. When we discuss the differences of opinions in some of the details, be patient. I know that a lot of times I'm discussing the theory behind a number of different rulings, and you're like, why can't you just say the preponderant ruling and make the story short? Because if I were to tell you the preponderant ruling and just make the story short, guess what's going to happen? There's so many different questions that are going to be popping up in the future. And the most important question, why are there so many differences of opinions? Why every time I would ask a scholar, he would give me a different answer? What is the real answer? And then you're really putting yourself at the break of, I would call, fitna, in where you're getting a lot of questions really popping up unanswered. The main reason to it is because you don't understand and really have this view of what is really going on beneath the surface.
Oh yeah,
So
the like
surface,
the why, right? The why.
exactly, that why, what's happening? How did they, when, why did they have these differences of opinions? I know you won't go hunting, and I know you don't have catchy trained to get you into hunting. But at the same time, I'm going into details into, I know that probably everybody that would listen to my lectures is not going to be really using this ayah or utilizing it, at least in their life, because one, you really barely have any Muslims really going hunting, let alone having a trained dog for hunting. So only very few people would actually learn about this or at least need it. But what is more important than the whole thing about catchy or the dog catchy, um, the hypothetical case that we put about a dog named Catchy and whether it's halal or not, is really how they would understand a text, how they would take it, how they would debate it about a certain text, and how sometimes it basically had different interpretations. That's what's really important, because when you're seeing these cases of debate in interpreting the text, the system, and let me say the method of debate, it really goes in the same order, or at least the same system, in where we're trying to interpret the text. Is it a metaphor? Is it a literal interpretation? How do we understand all of this? Is it something that we're here seeing contradictory? How do we actually get into these contradictions and understand these contradictory stories or contradictory texts? And what do we do about them? How do we understand this? Is this authentic? Well, is that one authentic? Which one really is authentic? And why is that one not authentic? Once you understand the whole vertebra of how they debated such matters, it becomes easy for you to understand the different reasons, one, behind the differences of opinions, two, how they basically got to a preponderant ruling, and three, the implication it has on you, in where one, respect for the ulama, that they really did have this wide and expansive ilm, in where they really were concerned to go back to the evidence, were really concerned to follow the text, and that too, that they were really wanting to put in and invest in understanding the text and not necessarily having their personal opinions project the different rulings. It was trying to let the text speak the ruling and not their own opinion influence the interpretation. That's the second conclusion that we're trying to get to. Number three is to remove the different misconceptions that might actually happen, that each and every single scholar is giving me his own opinion, therefore Islam itself is contradictory. That's a misconception. So what we're really trying to get to is more important more important than should I eat whatever the dog hunted, my hunting dog had caught or not. Because I know you're not going to be hunting, but it's just an issue for us to take as a start in order for us to grow in our vision of Islam, our vision of
I actually
scholarship.
remember I actually had that question for you a long time ago because my
Oh,
dad, he
absolutely.
hunts. So
Yeah,
I wanted to
absolutely.
know if it was halal to eat the meat, you
Right.
know?
So, we can get these cases, but they're really rare cases. Not many people actually have hunting dogs, but this isn't just here. I'm just letting our our understanding of Islam, let me say, widen, and I'm letting our understanding of Islam also, let me say, get enhanced in where we're really having a good foundation in how we understand text, how we broaden our vision, and how we enhance our connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and deepen our, let's say, our roots to the text itself, that this is wahi. We take seriously. And this isn't something where, yeah, not a big deal. Sure, you can. And this is really common in certain communities in where, yeah, take it from me. That's all right. Not a big deal. And when you see scholars were debating such a matter and they were taking it seriously, and where no, they've got an evidence for each and every single case. So it's not just, yeah, not a big deal. Yeah, I don't see anything wrong with it. And it's like putting their own opinion. And they would think that just because someone said it, that sure, I can say the same thing and I can put my opinion in this. And when you would see these scholars are putting all the effort to say, well, this hadith is sahih, this hadith is da'if, here's where this hadith is that interpretation has gone wrong. This is where the interpretation had gone right, etc. You would see that commitment in putting in so much effort to make sure that their interpretation and their connection was to the wahi and not necessarily to their own selves. That's where that commitment is. And that's why, once we put in this commitment, this relationship with our own understanding of Islam, that's when we will grow. Let's say it that way. That's when we will grow in our understanding, not only of Islam, but also understanding of how the scholars put so much effort to bring about, one, the connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and two, the connection to their own Islam. So that's really one side, that very important side that we can connect. Now, a question that was asked, can we eat cockroach soup, for example? Sorry, it sounds like a very disgusting question, but we were really trying to answer even more than the cockroach soup, okay? It's really trying to answer, remember these E numbers that are put on in the ingredients of a lot of different products, in where the E numbers, a lot of them are actually coming in really where they're different insects that they would use different things from these insects. And of course, they're presented and put in these candies, etc. So, what we did yesterday was really see whether these are considered as part of a tayyibat or not. And the scholars that understood at-tayyibat, well, they said, well, we're going to understand at-tayyib to mean anything that is cute, clean, anything that is pure, anything that is supposedly tayyib. But wait a minute, who defines tayyib? Who defines pure? Who defines good? That's a very comprehensive wording. Who defines all of these different things? And the first group of scholars, well, they said, well, we're going to go back to the people of Medina. The second group of scholars, they said, well, I mean, certainly we know that these animals are disgusting. In the third group of scholars, they said, well, if it's not what was mentioned in the hadith or the Quran and the Sunnah to be identified as considered, let's say, pure, then in that situation, it would be considered as impure. Well, the third group of scholars, or the fourth, I guess right now we got to, was saying, well, everything is supposed to be pure slash tayyib unless proven otherwise. Well, then you had another debate. Well, is it really everything is supposed to be halal unless proven otherwise, or is it everything is supposed to be haram unless proven otherwise? So that's another debate. I'm not going to go into all the debates, but I just want you to know what's in the underground of each and every single, let's say, ruling, or at least each and every single opinion, that there's a huge debate behind it. So to easily say halal, haram, etc., and just get to this kind of irtijali, let's call it that way, irtijali, or each one is just like, just take it from me. There's nothing wrong with it. No, there's actually a whole academic and a scholarly work that is behind each and every single conclusion that the scholars got to. So therefore, respecting those positions, in respecting the scholarly work that is presented, is actually part of having and showing the ilm, not necessarily that we have, but that they have, that we're aware of the great work that is behind each and every single debate. The commitment, the conviction to the wahi is extremely important. So when we discuss, for example, the E numbers, is it part of a tayyibat? Is it this cockroach soup that helped this sister, I guess, face some illness by going to Chinese medicine, and they gave her cockroach soup and it really helped her, etc. Is it the right thing? And is it an alternative? And similarly, we're not just talking about just probably insects or probably, I don't know, different moving things. But even if we're discussing plants, things like CBD that is right now sold, CBD, and where there's a certain number of THS, which basically is a certain chemical, and it can result into some form of intoxication or a level of intoxication. And right now it's widely sold, CBD, and right now even at the level of um, uh, House of Representatives and the Senate, and they're discussing all of that, whether it should be legal or not. Should we sell these things? Are they healthy? Are they leading to intoxication? What really is the effect of these different items? Is this part of a tayyib or not? And that's another debate. You see, you might think, well, what's the big idea about a tayyib? Yeah, that's the thing, is that the reason why scholars would even go into this debate is really trying to understand, if we're looking at CBD as an example, what is CBD? So CBD, things like marijuana, as an example. And we know that right now it's basically widely shared that there are certain people that might be going through epilepsy, certain neurological diseases, but then nothing is helping them out of all that medication except using CBD or at least marijuana. And when they used marijuana, they basically got better. And here's the thing, is that is this halal or not? Well, we're not just talking about marijuana, but let's say other plants, okay, different plants that is it going to be something that I have to ask somebody that is specialized in what is that specialty where they're specialized in, what is it called? Homeopath? I think that's what it's called, homeopath, and the medication and the medications that we would get out of plants and
Yeah,
all
like
these
yeah,
different
homeopath.
homeopath, there you go. And of course, your doctor is not trained in the different herbs, so they're not going to give you the herbs to use for your illness because they're only trained to basically relate to the different pharmaceutical approved, let's say the pharmacy and that industry and what was approved and what was also researched, and this is extremely important, what was also researched, within their area of research. So they're not going to give you, and they're definitely not trained to prescribe, this or that plant. So some people don't want to use this area, which is the area of medicine, and prefer going through the area of homeopath. But here's one thing is that the homeopath medicine, they didn't actually do the same type of extensive research that you see in medical schools. Medical schools, they basically get paid, and certainly we know that a lot of what was funded is basically coming from different areas, and a lot of it is definitely coming from pharmaceutical companies that fund certain research, not necessarily for the sake of research, but sometimes for the sake of certain medications. So some people lose their trust in that area of study or that area of, let's say, a treatment, and would prefer going through the research, or at least what was experienced in terms of different areas of herbal medication. All right. So let's take it. Are these herbs part of a tayyib? Why would we even discuss herbs? Well, we would discuss it because we know that things like wine is really an herb. It's basically coming from different plants. The herb, whether it's grapes or whether it's barley or whether it's apples or whatever it is, it's supposed to be an herb. It's supposed to be a plant-based, at least a plant-based drink. And that's the thing, is that although it's a plant-based drink, but that drink is regarded as haram because of the fact that it can lead to intoxication. So then the question comes in, where is every plant necessarily halal? Well, no. If it leads to intoxication or it leads to any type of harm, let's say it doesn't lead to intoxication, but it leads to some kind of a harm on the body, whether it's heart palpitations, or basically, hey, you can touch a certain plant like poison ivy and you can really get sick, and it can be fatal for some people. So in that situation, we just need to recognize that certain plants, although plants, but can actually be really dangerous. So just because it's out there, it doesn't make it halal. And that's where Islam comes in to say, well, before I would tell you whether that plant is halal slash tayyib or not, I would need to ask the experts. I would need to go to the experts and tell them and ask them, what do you say in regards to such plants? These plants, are they going to lead probably to, I don't know, infertility, fertility? Are they going to lead to heart problems? What is the implication for the consumers of that plant? Is it going to lead to intoxication? What is what is the level and how much of it leads to intoxication? Can it be used in any way as a medication? And therefore, we would ask another question. Do we necessarily need to go to the experts to tell us that, yes, they do lead to some kind of treatment? What if I tried my own? So basically, I one time, let's say not myself, but let's say somebody says, hey, I know that the experts say that this CBD is not leading to treatment, but my experience, I've tried it before, and it was the only thing that helped my severe headache. Okay. So in that situation, can I depend on the person's experience, or do I have to get an expert's experience or the expert's research in order to make a fatwa? Why am I even asking all that? It's basically helping us understand. So these are all questions. I know I'm not answering all these questions, but I'm just letting you know those areas of research, the area of debate, just to understand, well, when it says قُلْ أُحِلَّ لَكُمُ الطَّيِّبَاتِ, and say what was permitted upon you is basically anything that is tayyib, anything that is good, anything that is pure. It's a very broad term, but it really doesn't answer all the questions. It basically just lets us know that this is an area where scholars were really trying to investigate and do these, let's call them paradigms and regulations, to make sure that whenever we would get a product, whether we're speaking about an herb or whether we're speaking about foods or whether we're speaking about different items that we're getting, probably plant-based or animal-based, or let's say creature-based, all right, that's their area of research. Their area of research is within the light of two things. Within the light of one, the text that regarded certain things as haram, and two, within the light of their effect, okay? Within the light of their base and within the light of their effect. Those are the two areas that we would research. So within the light of their, let's say, base, is it herb, is it this, and what really, looking at the through the lens of their basis. So we would look at that. And number two is the area, is basically the area of their effect. So that's where we would need the experts, whether in chemistry or whether in probably biochemistry or within the area, medicine, etc. That's where we would reach out to those experts to tell us, well, your research, tell us your research. What is the effect? Can we regulate and make sure that we're putting these two sides together, which is the base and also the effect, in order to give us this regulation in where we're reaching the final thing, which is maqasid al-sharia. Because in maqasid al-sharia, the whole thing about maqasid al-sharia is really, one, to preserve the body and to preserve the mind, and definitely to preserve the chastity and to preserve the deen, of course. I mean, that's the first thing. But within these three or four or five different things, we're seeing, okay, well, how can we use the different regulations? Can we, before we say something is haram, can we put in regulations to make sure that, remember, part of the legal maxims of Islam is not necessarily, yes, we want somebody to just be saved, but part of it is to also reduce the pain. In other words, the quality of life. That's also part of the legal maxims of Islam. So it's not just telling you, yeah, I just want you, that's it. As long as you're surviving and you're alive, that's all that matters. But even the quality of life is also considered, it's also considered let's say, a purpose in Islam, because the quality of life, but not based on my interpretation of quality of life. It's basically we're basically considering لا ضرر ولا ضرار, to remove the harm, whether the harm in what's affecting your life or whether it's the harm in what's affecting your focus, the quality of life, but of course, based on الضرر يزال. And الضرورة تقدر بقدرها, based on two things. Number one, we're supposed to be removing the harm. Number two, الضرورة تقدر بقدرها. Whenever we're speaking about a necessity, we're going to take in consideration the amount that we're considering as halal just to get to the object or at least the purpose in where we need to remove the harm as needed and not necessarily exceed the limit from moving harm to actually getting it into the area of entertainment. So if somebody needed to use marijuana for, let's say, treatment purposes, we need to make sure that it stays within the parameter of treatment purposes and not necessarily moving out of the treatment purpose to making it into right there recreational purposes. Because if it goes from treatment to recreational, well, in that situation, you basically went into the haram area. So in that situation, from going, and it's really a small, fine line from treatment to recreational, it's really a small fine line, and it can go far. It can go really far. And I've had people actually tell me that their addiction really started from taking cough medications. It was just a cough medication that led them into basically getting that addiction, or probably, just different things that could be around them. It started out with a small, simple thing, but then it led them to another kind of addiction. So this is a fine line in where how do we put in these regulations to make sure that it's within the parameter of tayyib, within the parameter of what is bringing good. And certainly that's the area of debate. That's the area of that whole discussion. So that's the area of that whole discussion. And hopefully, inshallah, we would have an idea. Sorry about that. I'm getting over warm here. I know here in Malaysia, and sometimes trying to turn these things on is quite challenging. All right, here we go. So we left off وما علمتم من الجوارح مكلبين تعلمونهن مما علمكم الله فكلوا مما أمسكنا عليكم. This is exactly where we left off at فكلوا مما أمسكنا عليكم. And here we go. تعلمونهن مما علمكم الله. And certainly we're talking about the wild birds that we might train. And of course, there is no difference between scholars. They didn't have any differences that if we're talking about the animals that we might train, number one is that the first condition is that they would follow directions. They would follow the directions. They would follow the orders. And as well as the other piece of following the direction is whenever I would basically forbid them or at least stop them from doing anything. In other words, the direction to do something or to avoid doing something, then in that situation, we would then say that this is a trained dog. They know what they're supposed to do, what they're not supposed to do in order to keep them within one object, that is to hunt the animal that we want them to hunt and not to start eating it themselves. In other words, they're trained to get into that hunting purpose, bring whatever they hunted that they were ordered to do, and basically become that target in where instead of an actual probably bow and arrow, it's basically my dog that's doing a different kind of hunting. So in that situation, same thing if we're talking about, well, you can also not only dogs, but if you trained a cheetah, good luck. If you trained a cheetah or you trained probably a lion to do the job for you. Well, good luck. You could also do the same thing, in where the same thing that applies onto dogs, the same ruling would apply onto the different wild animals that are trained. If you're capable of training them to basically do and get a different direction done, and also they know how to abstain from certain things you don't want them to do, so they recognize their do and don't. So in that situation, if you would also get wild animals to be trained to do the same thing, then it would be permissible. But then they had differences of opinions on birds. The reason why they had different opinions on birds hunting for you is because I guess when it comes to birds, I don't want to use the word intellect, but I can't think of any other word. So if their ability to understand, ability to apply the directions and whether to do or not to do. So in that situation, that's where, of course, they had these differences of opinions. Shafi'i, that he basically had this interesting takhrij. And what we mean by takhrij is basically looking at the evidences and coming out, of course, with the final statement, in where he basically said the majority of the scholars, Shafi'i had put a regulation or at least a condition in the majority of the scholars that, well, if this wild bird or this trained bird, let's call it that way, is capable of catching this prey for you, and of course, and that's basically the end result. So not necessarily in where, yes, you're telling, let's say, Birdie, hey, I want you to do this, and they don't necessarily understand what you do or what you want them to do. Unlike dogs, they can actually get trained, and you can say, run, go get it, or they can probably sniff something, and they're capable of, giving you directions, and where, hey, there's something fishy here. They're able to communicate. Dogs are pretty smart compared to other animals. If it was halal for me to get a pet, I would definitely get a dog, to be honest. We had a dog as a young girl. We lived on a ranch, and we had a dog. His name was Gidgid. So definitely. And the reason why we had the dog was not entering our home, but Gidgid was basically because we also not only lived on a ranch, but we also had sheep, we had a cow, we had almost 6 horses. So we definitely needed a dog to be on the lookout, not only as, well, we didn't do hunting, but basically to be a guard dog. Okay, so this is part of the reasons why you can have a dog, which basically is for a guard dog. We'll go into details with that. Why did I even bring this up? Okay, so when we're looking at, for example, with birds, they don't necessarily communicate in the same way as dogs do, but they're capable of at least getting one thing done, which is, well, they're going to get a hunt and then they'll come back, and that's basically it. Not communicate in the same way, but at the end, they're capable of doing at least one object. So that's the majority of scholars. The majority of the scholars, they said, well, they don't have to communicate in the same way, but at least they're capable of getting the job done. All right, let's see. And of course, here Shafi'i said, well, that's the most important thing, that this bird is capable of getting the job done if basically, here, I'll give you the reward. The bird recognizes that if I were to do the purpose or the job or the goal, that I would probably get, a reward for it. And basically the bird comes back. So he doesn't run away, doesn't fly away, but knows, hey, I've got a job to do. I got the job done. I'll come back to basically my trainee. And therefore, in that situation, this would be considered as permissible to eat. And therefore, whatever this bird catches, all right, is that basically within the ayah? The answer is yes. Okay. And then, of course, they had differences of opinions on whether what if the bird eats part of this? Let's say the bird ate part of it. And of course, the amount of what the bird might eat is not necessarily and definitely not as much as the amount that a wild or at least a dog might eat. Because when the bird eats, it's a small amount. And of course, they went into differences of opinions. What if you were to suck some of that blood, basically, here out of dehydration or whatever it is? Is it permissible or not? Let's just go into it. I just want you to see this in where um, they basically considered, okay, what at the end, what makes a trained bird? Well, they're capable of one, going to that direction, that hunt that they were ordered to do and come back to the master. That's basically enough. So it's completely different than a trained dog, or at least what acts as a qualification, all right, for this bird that we would consider its hunting, or whether its hunt, but necessarily permissible, is that it's capable of doing the job and coming back. That's all that is to it. But for a dog, it's basically more sophisticated in where, because let's call it their level of understanding or their level of communicating is definitely much higher. So therefore, to consider them as qualified or not qualified is definitely going to be a more sophisticated test. Okay. All right. Let's go on with when we're talking about fakulu mimma amsakna alaykum. When we talk about fakulu, that means eat. Mimma, it's actually two words. This is min and ma. So from what amsakna, from what they had caught for you, or caught for you. And of course, when we say caught for you, that would simply mean that they caught as basically for the sake of hunting. All right. So when we say caught for you, means they kept for you. Then scholars had differences of opinions when we say caught for you. How do we actually consider that they caught for us? Is it that they didn't eat from that prey, or is it that that they basically they basically just caught and brought it for you? How do we actually understand all of that? The first group of scholars, they basically said, well, even though they had differences of opinions, but the first group of scholars, they said, well, what it means to amsakna alaykum is that they did not eat from it. So that was the opinion of all these scholars right here. Abu Huraira, Nakhai, Qatada, Jubair, etc., and Ibn Jubair, sorry. And of course, all these different scholars, they basically said, well, mimma amsakna alaykum, meaning that they didn't eat from it. So they caught or they hunted the animal for you and they didn't start eating from it. And therefore, what if they started eating from it? They said, well, if فإن أكل لم يؤكل ما بقي. The first group of scholars, they said, well, if that animal, that hunting animal, started eating from that animal, that means it's impermissible to eat the remaining pieces, or at least the remaining parts of that animal, even though you directed it to go and hunt for you. But what if it started eating from it? The first group of scholars, they basically said, the ayah was putting it putting the condition that only if they did not start eating from it. If they started eating from it, then therefore you cannot consume the rest. Well, the second group of scholars, of course, well, then they went into another debate in where, in terms of birds, بل يؤكل ما أكلت من. The second group of scholars, the Hanafi in particular, they said, well, for the birds, if they basically ate, and in other words, they snatched some of it, it doesn't mean that you're not going to eat the rest, and therefore you can eat the remaining part because the bird just snatched a small area. All right, that's the second opinion. Let's say the third opinion. We're just gonna go into let's see. وإن أكل فإذا أكل الجارح كلبا كان أو فهدا أو طيرا أكل ما بقي من الصيد وإن لم يبقى إلا بضعة وهذا قول مالك وجميع أصحابه. The third opinion, here we go. The third opinion, and they said, well, فَكُلُوا مِمَّا أَمْسَكْنَا عَلَيْكُمْ. They said this is basically a comprehensive statement in where if they caught something, and even if they had eaten part of it, then in that situation, just because they ate some of it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's haram, because they said, well, the ayah was really giving us a broad statement, and even if they were to eat from it, whether it's a bird or whether it's a dog or whether it's a wild animal like a cheetah that you had trained, you can eat what remained out of it, even if there's a small amount. Why? They said because the ayah was generally here a comprehensive statement. It's basically leaving it as a broad statement in where it says, فَكُلُوا مِمَّا أَمْسَكْنَا عَلَيْكُمْ. This eat from what they caught for you. So they caught for me. It didn't necessarily put on a condition on if only they ate from it or they didn't eat from it. Therefore, we're just going to leave it as a generalized statement and just say, well, they caught it for me and they ate some of it, but it doesn't necessarily mean they didn't catch it for me. So this was actually the statement, or at least the wording that was adopted by Imam Malik and of course the different Malikis as well. And Shafi'i himself, I want to look at this one. It says, وَهُوَ الْقَوْلِ الثَّانِي لِلشَّافِعِي. It's kind of surprising for many. I thought Shafi'i actually said the first statement. How he, right there, in where is Shafi'i, right there. How can Shafi'i actually say, well, on a condition that this hunting animal didn't eat, and at the same time, Shafi'i actually had a second statement. You can't say two statements at the same time or two opinions at the same time. Well, if you were to even look at Ahmad ibn Hanbal, you would actually see a lot more statements in where you can have statements 4 and 5 and 6 upon that were narrated upon Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Why would they have two statements? Number one, for Shafi'i, in where Shafi'i himself actually had an old madhab, which is really in al-Hujjah al-Fiqh, when he was with Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani in Baghdad, and that was his old madhab. But when he migrated or traveled to Egypt and met Layth ibn Sa'd, he had a new madhab. In other words, he basically learned something new and he basically had a new madhab. So that's one reason. The second reason is that because these scholars didn't necessarily document, because documentation wasn't as easy as today, where you would have Microsoft Word and just type it down, and it's so easy to just write it down. At the time, documentation was rather sophisticated. So they had to use different methods to document, and what definitely was not always that easy. Today, you could just boom, say it, and it's way easy to say. And you know what? I can give this whole lecture and make AI make it into a written lecture. It's really simple. So I had done two things, but during that time, it wasn't that easy. It was to write in their simplest method of writing was actually using a feather. And imagine the time that it would actually take to use the doer and basically to use this feather and to use the ink, and even the ink was actually expensive, and so was the material that was used for writing. So it wasn't that easy, and that's why sometimes you can have different students document different information or at least different conclusions that their own scholars had. So that's one other reason. So when you look at وهو القول الثاني للشافعي, let's see right there in where ذكره ابن العربي. Now here's one mistake that even this محقق had actually done. When you say ذكره ابن العربي في أحكام القرآن, well, that's actually a mistake to go to because Ibn al-Arabi is Maliki. I want to look at that. Just because it's mentioned in a book, it doesn't mean they would make a mistake. If this was a PhD dissertation, man, they would really point this out and say, well, wait a minute. Ibn al-Arabi is Maliki. How could you go to a reference that is Maliki in order to say whether the Shafi'i had said the statement or not? You would have to go to the official books of the Madhab Shafi'i in order to document whether that is real or not. In other words, there's really a lot to really understand when we're doing our research. We're really particular. All right, let's see. Here, why would they have even these differences of opinions? I want you to look at this one. There are actually two ahadith, but these two ahadith are rather sounding very contradictory. Let's look at them. So the first hadith is narrated by Muslim. In other words, there's no way that we can question its authenticity. What is that hadith? Well, this hadith in where it was narrated off Adi ibn Hatim, the same Sahabi that we basically had talked about who was Christian, came to the Prophet ﷺ and was doubting whether he should become Muslim because he saw the Muslims were looking rather, let's say, the lower class of, let's say, at least the financial status and, of course, economical status. And certainly they weren't necessarily considered as the higher end of political status. And the list goes on and on. We talked about that, so we're not going to go in details. And the Prophet ﷺ was telling him, now this guy was definitely coming back from a rich background. Let's see, the Prophet ﷺ, when Adi ibn Hatim asked him about the trained dogs, or the trained dogs, basically the hunting dogs, the Prophet ﷺ tells him, وَإِذَا أَكَلَ فَلَا تَأْكُلْ. If this dog started eating, basically the hunting dog started eating this prey, then don't eat from it. فإنما أمسك على نفسه. Because if the dog started eating that prey, then in that situation, you would know that he caught that animal for himself and not necessarily for you. So in that situation, you would recognize that this dog ceases to be from a hunting dog. In other words, the purpose was supposed to be hunting. But all of a sudden, you could say that this dog was really hunting for himself. In other words, it's not hunting anymore. And
Oh,
this
so you're
dog,
saying it's more of his food?
exactly. So
Okay.
this is what was
So he wasn't hunting
understood.
for the owner, he was hunting
Well,
for himself at that point.
Exactly. So
Okay.
then, in other words, it goes within, remember this ayah right there, and well, okay, and تعلمونهن مما علمكم الله, that basically فكلوا مما أمسكنا عليكم. What you had trained them to do, they basically did, and then therefore, whatever they caught for you, you would basically eat what they had caught for you. But of course, we know that ما أكل السبع, what a wild animal, or at least a carnivore animal, had basically caught, you're not going to be eating from it. In other words, it's a really fine line between فَكُلُوا مِمَّا أَمْسَكْنَا عَلَيْكُمْ, between this area and certainly this area. It's a really fine line in where is this borderline in where it moves it from this area to the other area. And that's where this hadith is basically laying out these parameters. So be careful with this one. Let's see. So this first hadith is authentic in where, well, if it's eating, if it ate whatever it caught, then that situation, it didn't do the object of what you asked it to do, then don't eat from it. And because it started eating from it, that means it caught it for itself. And therefore, that's the first parameter that this hadith is laying out. The second hadith contradicts the first hadith. Let's look into it. So, Abi Tha'la or Abu Tha'laba, since I'm basically beginning my sentence in Arabic, in English here, so then it becomes right there, a different context, even though, yeah, this is all right. Abu
Are
Tha'laba
we gonna,
al-Khushan.
oh, sorry. Are we gonna mention the authenticity of those? Are they
Oh
at the
yeah,
same
girl,
like rank?
definitely.
Okay,
Whenever I
okay.
would state a hadith, I would definitely mention the authenticity of the hadith. We can't just mention a hadith without mentioning the details of what classification is it within. Okay, let's see. So yeah, the first hadith that we mentioned, of course, we mentioned it was in Sahih Muslim. So here we go, akhrajahu Muslim, right there. Here's the number of hadith in Sahih Muslim. Okay, all right, let's continue. The second hadith is narrated by Abu Thalib al-Khushani, in where that the Prophet ﷺ, when Abu Thalib al-Khushani asked him about the hunting dogs, the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا أَرْسَلْتَ كَلْبَكَ وَذَكَرْتَ اسْمَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ فَكُلْ وَإِنْ أَكَلَ مِنْهِ وَكُلْ مَا رَدَّتْ عَلَيْكَ يَدُكَ. What does that mean? If you send out your dog and you mention the name of Allah, then eat even if it ate from it. Well, that's a completely different statement and definitely contradicting the first hadith. This is straightforward. Eat even if it ate from it. And eat وَكُلْ مِمَّا رَدَّتْ عَلَيْكَ يَدُكَ. And whatever, in other words, here we go, whatever your hand basically had touched, in other words, it's right there and you see it in front of you. And here's the thing. This hadith was narrated Abu Dawood. Let's look into right there, Abu Dawood, and definitely here's the hadith number. Let's look into it. And of course, وَرُوِيَ عَنْ عَدِي. In fact, the same exact quote was also mentioned upon Adi. In other words, the same guy that narrated the hadith that we had mentioned before. But he said, وَلَا يَصِحْ. In other words, here in Qurtubi is not saying that this hadith is narrated in a non-authentic narration. He's basically saying, well, the narration upon Adi is not authentic. And he said it's actually right there narrated by Abu Thalib al-Khushani, and the hadith is basically hadith Muslim. Or وَالصَّحِيحُ عَنْهُ hadith Muslim. The authentic hadith upon Adi is basically this hadith right here. Okay, so that clears out some part of it. But here's one thing. They're not necessarily here saying that this hadith is not authentic, but there's definitely saying a contradictory in these two narrations. And that's why when they saw these contradictions, they basically had debated, is this necessarily right there telling us, is it permissible or not permissible? Sometimes you could say the scholars would say, well, what we're looking into is that, number one, that it's actually permissible to eat from the animal. So here we go. If it started eating from it, they said, well, in general, it's permissible because this hadith is basically telling us that it's permissible. That's the first interpretation. And this hadith is basically telling Adi ibn Hatim, because he was capable of affording, let's say, to take a second try to, well, he had 5 dogs. In other words, it wasn't hard for him. And plus, he was an upper class. In other words, he was capable of affording to get more and to get into a better case in where, well, if it caught for you, then eat from it. But if it didn't, well, he was actually capable of taking, let's say, taking what there is no doubt in. But for this guy, he was definitely, let's just say, not as rich as Adi. So that's the first one. They said in that situation, when the Prophet ﷺ tells Adi, don't eat from it, and that was basically to tell him that this is tanzih and wara. This is the first interpretation. What is tanzih and wara? Tanzih is basically what was recommended. So the Prophet ﷺ was recommending for him, and it's better for your faith to actually not eat from that animal that was hunted for you. If this hunting dog already started eating from it, that was what was recommended. But those cases where you didn't have, let's say, you didn't have that possibility or couldn't afford to basically get more, then in that situation, it's basically telling you it's permissible, but it's best if you would take your precautions and not eat from it. So they didn't say that it was haram per se, but they just said, well, the first hadith is basically telling you that that's recommended, and the second hadith is basically telling you that it's permissible, but it's not necessarily the best thing to do. All right. And what's the evidence? How did they get that far? And how did they make such interpretation? So they said,
Yeah,
Adi.
mashallah, they really thought about it.
Exactly.
Subhanallah.
So here, Adi, they said, well, Adi was actually muwassa'an alayh. Adi was considered, a rich person. He basically had the different means for that. And the Prophet ﷺ was basically teaching him that, listen, you've got the ability. So therefore, take in consideration what was more recommended and put in the effort to go up in your standards. Okay. So when somebody is capable of affording something, then go up with your standards, not lower your standards. Okay. And of course, Abu Thalaba was actually in need. So his standards to go up were really scarce. It wasn't easy for Abu Thalaba to go up with his standards because he was actually in need. So the Prophet ﷺ had given him al-jawaz, had given him the permission that it's permissible to eat from it. Why? Because remember, when you're looking at somebody's situation, it's part of the fatwa, and this is absolutely and completely part of wisdom. And that's why when we speak of even giving the fatwa, it's important to understand the circumstances that these people are in. There's a general statement in fiqh. We say, al-hukmu ala shay. Let's write it down. Al-hukmu ala shay. Al-hukmu ala shay. Far'un an tasawwurihi. Whenever you want to make a statement or you want to make a rule, it is basically it's basically reflecting the amount of knowledge and the amount of how much you see of that circumstance. فرع عن تصوره. So it's important to understand the circumstances that people are living in. It's important to understand the situations, because by giving one statement and one fatwa for everybody is exactly like giving the medication for each and every single illness or each and every single case. You could actually be killing a lot of people, because some people, that medication is good for them, but others, they might have high blood pressure problems, diabetes, whatever it is. So therefore, you need to make sure you're aware of that prescription slash fatwa that you're giving people. So in order to understand, we could also see this hadith in where the Prophet ﷺ had given two, let's call them contradictory, and where it appears as contradictory, but that's because the circumstances were different. The circumstances were different, and understanding the circumstance is part of knowing how much of a high standard do I want to get that person into? Can that person afford it? Is that person even capable of living up to, let's say, that recommendation? That's part of fiqh. That's part of understanding. Understanding is not only understanding the text, but it's also important to understand the context. Understanding the context is not contradictory to understanding the text itself. So this hadith teaches us that, yes, you have to look at the circumstances. All right, let's see. And they said, well, here's the evidence. They said, the Prophet ﷺ said, فَإِنِّي أَخَافُ أَنْ يَكُونَ إِنَّمَا أَمْسَكَ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ. So here, there is another piece of that hadith in where he said, I would fear that the dog might have actually caught it for himself. And therefore, if you are capable of seeing that the hunting dog that you sent out was doing a particular object, then in that situation, the word akhafu, I fear, in other words, this is reflecting and definitely projecting that this is for al-wara. This is for piety and not necessarily telling you that it's haram, but it's basically doing it for the sake of making sure that just on the end of trying to put a higher standard. So that's their evidence of why they regarded, well, here's the tanzih and al-wara. All right. The second opinion, which is mentioned by Abu Umar or Hafiz al-Maghrib or Ibn Abd al-Barr, and we talked about him, so we're not going to go into details with that. And he said, well, these two hadith, certainly they would seem they are contradictory, but they're not. Well, how did you say that they were not? He said, well, they're not because one of them is basically abrogating the other. Wait a minute, wait a minute. Abrogating here? He said, yes, abrogating. Well, what does abrogating mean? Abrogating would mean that one is canceling out the other ruling. And of course, when we're speaking about canceling out the other ruling, it basically needs two conditions. Number one, we're speaking about ruling. Number two, we need to know that one basically came later. In other words, the chronology of these two statements are basically known to us in order to say which one is first and which one is later. So here we go. He said, well, the Prophet ﷺ said, وَإِنْ أَكَلَ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ قَالَ وَإِنْ أَكَلَ. So basically, he said the evidence is number one in where the hadith actually was in the context in where the Prophet ﷺ, when he was asked even if it ate from it, and he said even if it did eat from it, even if it started eating from it. And of course, this hadith was basically mentioned by these two references, and that's basically the objection. Well, here's the thing. To say that one of them is abrogating was definitely objected by al-Qurtubi, and even though he comes from the same madhab as Abu Umar, which is Maliki, but he said, actually, this area, we won't necessarily agree on that. Fihi nazar. This really needs scrutiny. Why did you say it needed scrutiny? He said, well, because to actually say that this statement or these, one of them cancels out, in other words, the chronology is telling us one came later and the other one came before. He said, well, this statement is basically requiring scrutiny because we don't really know the history of when one said which one of them was said
Oh yeah, that's
first
true.
and
We
which one.
don't really know, right?
We don't really know. In other words, to make a statement and say, yes, one of them was abrogated, he said, well, no. So since we don't really know the history and which one came first and which one came later, to just say, yeah, one of them is abrogating the other, we'll say, no, sorry, but we don't necessarily agree with your hypothesis. So in that situation, we're just going to take both a hadith, and here we'll do al-jama. We're going to take both of them and actually accept both of them, and therefore to cancel one of them out is rather dangerous, because if you're canceling one of them out, you're basically here letting go of a very important statement. To cancel one out is basically letting go of an important piece of information. So therefore, we're going to take both of them, since both of them are basically at least authentic, even if we don't know the history. So we would basically have to understand and take both of them in consideration. And from that basis, and of course, this hypothesis, oh boy, you know what? Sorry. But I actually forgot that my technician is coming over right now. I'm going to stop right here. They just rang the bell. And inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow. Sorry about that. They
No,
just rang,
that's okay.
and I forgot
Life
about it.
happens. Life happens. Okay.
Exactly.
Assalamu
Exactly. There you go.
alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.